The topic of this panel, the ideological struggle between autocracy and democracy, couldn't be more timely or important, and I'm very pleased to have Scott Carpenter with us to guide our discussion of it. Scott is a true champion of free expression and an expert on the Near East region. In his current role as Director of Free Expression, but wouldn't that be a great job? At Google Ideas, Scott works to make online repressive censorship irrelevant. Previously, as the Keston Family Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, he founded and directed Project Fikra, an initiative to defeat extremism through the power of ideas. Scott served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, and as a coordinator for the broader Middle East and North Africa initiative. Above all, though, Scott has championed freedom of expression and respect for human rights as the best defense against autocratic and extremist ideology. Scott, we're glad to have you. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. I'd like to thank Human Rights First for the invitation. I'd like to thank them especially for the opportunity to wear a suit and a tie. I work for Google these days, so usually just remembering to wear pants is a challenge. But I am great to be here amongst adults and to have a very serious discussion about the challenges that we collectively face. I was very happy to hear that Senator Kirk's announcement of the Human Rights Caucus, because these sorts of tools are going to be increasingly important as we engage more deeply in this ideological struggle that we're here to talk about. I guess it should come as no surprise to all of you who pay attention to these issues that for the 8th consecutive year, Freedom House, in describing freedom in the world, has noted that democracy is in a decline. Just this past week, Freedom House also issued their Freedom on the Net survey, which is of a smaller number of countries. But for the 4th consecutive year, Freedom on the Net has been in decline. And since the report is only 5 years old, that means every year it's been written, internet freedom has been in decline. But the flip side, and so that's something to bemoan and to be deeply concerned about. But the flip side of if you stated it the other way, is that authoritarians are gaining. And their ideas about what it is, their ideas and the reasons why they are becoming stronger, their narrative, which they own, is also growing. So while we bemoan this fact, they celebrate it. Because, you know, democracies, they say, are weak, they're inefficient, they're fractious, they're hypocritical, they don't plan well, their institutions falter, they don't live up to their own expectations in terms of their economies, they grow slowly, if at all, when they do grow, they're unequal. So we need something better. And democracy does not provide order, it doesn't provide security. And this narrative is taking hold in many parts of the world. And it's complicated by the fact that in many democracies, we don't really think that our institutions are doing such a great job either. We lack a bit of confidence. You know, with the report that has come out just yesterday again, and we've discussed it a lot here at in the margins of this event. We're going to hear more about it later tonight. We question whether or not our institutions are up to the task. Do we have the right to advocate for the universality of our values? These are questions that we're grappling with. And I think it's right to try to understand from the perspective of some of these authoritarians why it is that even in a country like Hungary that we're going to think about, where a democratically elected leader who was present at the fall of the Berlin Wall is now championing, if I can say that word, championing a doctrine of illiberal democracy. This is something to be emulated, not not to be fought. So I think we're going to have a very engaging discussion on these issues, and we have 4 amazing panelists here with us to discuss them. I'm not going to read their impressive biographies for you. You should all have the pamphlet that Human Rights First has provided for you to be able to get further information. But I do want to say something interesting about each one of them as I've gotten to know them just a little bit. Mohammed Tabar, who is a very impressive academic who knows a lot about Iran, but also has written sagely about Egypt and some of these questions about security and insecurity when it comes to what democracy produces and delivers. But I didn't know that Mohammed was in his past a former BBC reporter, which explains a lot of his curiosity and ability and facility with language. I also learned, and he hasn't included this on his bio, but at some point in the dark, dark past, he was an intern at Human Rights First. So I thought I would...
Human Rights Watch.
Human Rights Watch, I'm sorry, Human Rights Watch. To my left, Zach, mild-mannered professor at Simmons College, just got back from 3 weeks in the deep south of Thailand where he's exploring insurgency and human rights. Very engaged and engaging guy on subjects that are near and dear to many of us, that explores that nexus between counterinsurgency and human rights. Carol, who's going to talk to us a bit more about Saudi Arabia and what she's seen there, is not doing it from her desktop. She spent 3 years living and working in Saudi Arabia, which is not a very easy place to live and work, I can say from experience. And she's written a fascinating book looking at Saudi Arabia through the eyes of the 20-somethings in the country, who make up the vast majority of the population, by the way. So if you want to understand Saudi Arabia, you got to read that book. And Tomasz. Investigative journalists hold a very special place in my heart, and listening to Tomasz at dinner last night was really impressive. But one of the things that's most impressive to me is that, not content with having to rely on anybody, any institution for his investigative journalism, Tomasz and his organization is successfully crowdsourcing resources for their investigations for people who value the work that he does. So Tomasz, we look forward to hearing from you. To start the conversation, I'm going to turn to Carol, because I think when we think about authoritarianism and we think about extremism, we tend to think about our quote-unquote or erstwhile enemies, right? So it's countries like maybe China or Iran, for instance. But Saudi Arabia is an ally of the United States in some ways, even though the way it organizes itself is not in a way that we would countenance as freedom lovers and erstwhile protectors of human rights. So, Carol, why don't we talk a little bit about that dilemma?
Good afternoon. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. The questions we were supposed to answer in this panel this afternoon, or the main question, was whether the authoritarian nature of our respective countries, in my case Saudi, present a challenge to U.S. foreign policy. But I think another question that has to be addressed in tandem with this is whether the authoritarian nature of Saudi Arabia challenges U.S. interests. And I think the answer to these two questions are as follows. Saudi presents a challenge to U.S. foreign policy if that policy really is to advance respect for human rights, tolerance of other opinions, tolerance for other religions, sexual orientation, and political views. As you know, U.S. foreign policy, however, is cleaved in two. We have a rhetorical foreign policy, and then we have the real policy. As for U.S. interests, the authoritarian nature of Saudi, I don't think, presents a challenge to Saudi right now, because it's one of the few stable and U.S.-friendly regimes in the Middle East at this moment, which is a boon for U.S. interests, because the United States wants to see stability above all else in this region. Please note I said Saudi stable at this moment. I'm not sure about the midterm future, say 10 years from now. Now I'd like to describe a little bit about what Saudi Arabia has been doing in the region. It's clear that Saudi Arabia didn't want the Arab Spring to result in any new regimes that presented a more attractive governing model for an Islamic state. And this is why Saudi Arabia has always been wary of Turkey and of the Muslim Brotherhood. So we saw Saudi Arabia work to forestall the Arab Spring, principally in Egypt, where it was very happy that the Muslim Brotherhood president had been removed, and it's now supporting financially and politically General Sisi, President Sisi. The other place where Saudi Arabia was very active was Bahrain, where it sent troops in, a very unusual move for Saudi Arabia, to boost the backing of the royal family in Bahrain. And this was because Saudi Arabia saw a challenge from the, Saudi Arabia is a Sunni Muslim state, and it saw a challenge from the Shiite opposition. And it was also fearing that Iran would start meddling in Bahrain. Now, curiously, Saudi Arabia got on the side of upheaval and revolution when it came to Syria. It became the first state to withdraw its ambassador from Damascus back in 2011. This was a special case for Saudi Arabia because it saw Syria as a way to give Iran, its main regional rival, a black eye. On top of the regional upheaval, Saudi Arabia also saw its relationship with Washington, which it had clearly seen as its closest ally, and was already badly strained by the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And after the Arab Spring, this bilateral relationship got even more strained for two major reasons. The Saudis saw the United States abandon Mubarak in Egypt, and they thought, wow, if Washington can do that to their ally in Cairo, what will they do to us if we face a similar situation internally? And secondly, Saudi Arabia was very displeased to find out that the United States was secretly negotiating for over a year with Iran, and those talks eventually led to the public talks on Iran's nuclear program. Now, internally, I think it's important to realize that the Saudis, they don't love the royal family, except maybe for King Abdullah. And there's a great amount of affection for this king, especially from women, because he's tried to advance women in education and in the workforce. They don't love their royal family in general, but very few want to get rid of them. The only groups that would like a change in the political system are the violent jihadis, who are a minority and they want to topple the state, and then the relatively small pro-democratic progressive Saudis who would like to see a gradual movement towards a constitutional monarchy. But most Saudis see that the royal family has to stay in place because they see it as the only way to guarantee that tribal, personal, and regional rivalries don't tear the country apart. So it's a very utilitarian relationship that they have with their royal family. When King Abdullah ascended the throne in 2000, now almost a decade ago, he began opening up. He gave the press more freedom to talk about problems in the state and to criticize officials. But since the Arab Spring, there's been a retrenchment. And any of you who have been reading human rights reports will know that Political reform activists, human rights activists have increasingly been arrested and put in jail for long terms. And the Saudis' tolerance for what people were saying on Twitter has kind of evaporated, and people are now being prosecuted and jailed for what they say on Twitter. Given these situations, what should U.S. do about Saudi Arabia's situation when it comes to human and political rights? I can go on, or I can leave that for the discussion. I have a couple of ideas.
Why don't we leave it for the discussion so that we can kind of play off one another a little bit more. I'm struck by the fact that when you think about the Arab Spring and you look around the region from Morocco all the way across to the Gulf, you're struck by the fact that it was only the republics that had the deep, deep challenges that ultimately led to the collapse of Gaddafi in Libya, Ben Ali in Tunisia, Mubarak in Egypt, threatened Bashar al-Assad, has torn the country apart. And it's the republics, and somehow the monarchies, it's helpful to be commander of the faithful at some level. There's a source of legitimacy that's slightly different. But this is a challenge, of course, to this notion of universal human rights norms and the idea of advancing democracy in a kingdom where the source of legitimacy is religion, something that we can come back to. But kind of to kind of make the transition then to talk a little bit about Iran, where the supreme leader and this rival in terms of who is it that leads the quote-unquote Muslim world has been a defining characteristic of the struggle that's been taking place in the region for 1,500 years and is clearly at play right now. So, Mohammed, I'll just turn it over to you for some thoughts.
Thank you, Scott, for your introduction. Thank you for inviting me. It's indeed a great honor to be speaking here today. What I want to do is I want to go and talk about the narrative that you mentioned earlier today, a narrative that comes out of the Iranian conservative camp. A couple of months ago, Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei made a very important, very interesting speech in a meeting with a group of some senior clerics in the country. He said that there is a new international order that is emerging. And he argued that the new order, in this new international order, the United States is not going to enjoy the same position that it did since World War II. And the implication was that if the US used its primary position after 1945 to universalize its own values and ideals, in this current position, it may not be able to do so as it did in the past. So he argued that there is a new opportunity for other states to be more assertive. And by being more assertive, he meant first militarily and strategically. And he has referred a number of times to the fact that the US has been struggling in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and especially after the Arab Spring. And then also politically, so Iran has been trying to export its electoral autocracy in the region, encouraging its allies in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, and other countries in the region to use democratic institutions, to use elections to come to power or to sustain their position. And last but not least, in addition to this military and political opportunities, there's also an opportunity to expand their own ideology. And by ideology, you see a number of different components. One of them is religion, indeed, which has different dimensions. One is Shiism. But Shiism has its own limit. Because Shiites are only 10% of the population, automatically Iran is on the losing end of this. So, and as he made in another, he made a point in another speech, they should use Islam as much as they can, but they should also use other issues. The other issue that is very effective and very important, and they've been using this since, especially since the '79 revolution, is anti-Americanism. And it is something that they think it can appeal to the non-Muslim population, in other areas. And this anti-American narrative is not necessarily new. It goes back to the at least early '90s, after the Iran-Iraq war, when Ayatollah Khamenei articulated the new challenges that the Islamic Republic was facing. And the new challenge was not necessarily militarily, but also a cultural, in the form of a cultural invasion of the West. And I'll be happy to talk about the mechanism of this in the Q&A later. But in this cultural invasion, and by the way, he made this speech in the early '90s, before the internet. And now he feels kind of vindicated that, see, I told you so, even back then. But that was when the satellite TV channels were becoming more and more popular, that they're using this because the US, because Iran has all these proxies in the region. It's more difficult for them to challenge Iran militarily. What they're going to do is, in the form of cultural invasion, they're going to empty us from inside. And in this regard, TV channels and now the internet and overall the media play a huge role. And he has said several times that the media is more dangerous than the atomic bomb. And it makes perfect sense from that perspective. So, and then, by the way, in this fear of the West or anti-American narrative, he doesn't feel alone anymore, and he thinks that Russia is coming on board right now, which is very very important. And he has said several times that this is anti-Americanism, or this battle of ideology is not just an abstract theoretical issue. No, it's a very pragmatic issue. It's a matter of survival, and anyone who has put an end to this kind of to this ideology has been overthrown, from the Soviet Union all the way to Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. So it is a matter of survival. And he thinks that the Russians, as I said, are not on board with him. They can be, with hopefully a return of a form of like a Cold War rivalry, maybe they can be an ally of Iran. But let me end by just saying, making one final point, and that is, the real challenge to this narrative is not actually coming from outside of Iran to this war of ideology. It's coming from within Iran. He's facing a population that does not believe in this rhetoric anymore as it did, let's say, back in '79. And even his own president is, to some extent, to some limited extent, is challenging him. And this is the interesting battle that you see is inside, is within the establishment, is between the state and the society as much as it is. In fact, it's more than what it is beyond the Iranian government.
Thanks, Mohammed. And it's interesting, that tension there, right? Because when the supreme leader talks about a cultural invasion and then sees the people disagreeing with him, it's easy to define what's taking place as a result of the cultural invasion, which is actually coming from these, again, universal set of desires for a different sort of system. But that cultural invasion theme, by the way, seems to be common across many of the countries and places that we're talking about. We don't have anybody on the panel to talk about Russia per se, but obviously that's a huge part of Putin's own rhetoric and narrative about the West. We have to protect our nation state, our sovereignty, our culture, what it means to be orthodox, etc., and that this is a very powerful motivator for those who are supporting Putin right now. But there is, according to Senator John McCain, a neo-fascist dictator in a country that used to be firmly embedded in the West, that's part of the European Union, that is also part of NATO, and that is Hungary. And so, Tamás, can you tell us what is going on?
Yeah, I think the neo-fascist dictator is an overstatement, so we are not that far yet. But the trend is bad. The trend is not good. It's funny that it's the same narrative than we heard before. In Hungary, the government is or the pro-government people are having marches, and the main message of these marches is that we will not be a colony. They put it on big posters that we will not be a colony. That means that they feel, or our government and its supporters feel, that we are somehow being colonized by the West, and it has to be ended. And we need an Eastern opening. We need to turn away from Western values. Of course, it didn't came out of the blue. From 1990 to 2010, Hungary started to move to the Western direction, and even only 10 years ago, it was a huge success that Hungary got enrolled in the European Union. But what followed was a rise in corruption, especially in political corruption. We got a lot of money from the EU, and politicians start to spend it in a crazy way. There is a huge problem with the foreign currency mortgage loans. In the last decade, a significant part of the Hungarian people took these loans, and now they are unable to pay them, and it caused a lot of trouble. And then came Viktor Orban, the new prime minister, who said that we need to change things here. We are not heading in a good direction. And what he announced, it's simply the authoritarian direction. So he said that we need a central power. We need a national cooperation. They called this system the political system of national cooperation, and that means that we have the governing party Fidesz in the center, and we have some opposition parties on the left and on the right as well, but they are marginalized, and they have no real weight. So Orban started to centralize power, started to marginalize and even criminalize political opposition, and then started to marginalize and smear critical voices which are not part of the political opposition. So for instance, to give you a picture, just a week ago, in the leading pro-government daily newspaper, Human Rights First was pictured as a conspiracy, as a part of a conspiracy against Hungary, along with the government of the United States, the CIA, and George Soros. So these are the forces who wants to attack Hungary, and this is the message the government propaganda keeps telling the people, that we are under attack from these forces. So, and Fidesz used the 2/3 majority it gained in 2010 in the parliament to change the constitution multiple times. So not one change, but multiple changes. They substantially modified the legal system and the cardinal laws without any consultation with opposition parties or anyone else. So they just modified the legal system. The governing party was rewriting and tweaking election laws before the 2014 elections to favor itself. They did some gerrymandering. They give voting rights to Hungarians living abroad. And they even created phantom parties with state support before the election to divide opposition support. So opposition was divided into several small parties. So this year's election were free but not fair. And then after they won the election again, they needed to have a new enemy, because this type of system always needs enemies to fight. It's a very militant, Orban and Fidesz uses a very militant rhetoric. They always need some kind of enemies to fight, to show that they are strong. And the new enemies are the NGOs, and they cracked down on the Norway NGO fund, which is funding a lot of critical NGOs in Hungary. At the same time, they don't like the media. They don't like independent media. They like only the media they own or they can control. So what they did, even from 2002, they started to build up a media empire on their own with companies, friendly companies, and they built a lot of media. And then when they won the elections, they occupied public service media, which is big in Hungary, and it costs a lot of money to the taxpayers, and they turned it into a propaganda machine to the government. And at the same time, they introduced extra taxes on advertising revenues recently to suppress independent media, which they don't own. And they have a new media law which has a chilling effect on remaining free media, because they have a media authority which has only Fidesz appointees on board. So there is a 5-member board, all Fidesz appointees who can fine any media companies. So Fidesz is eroding checks and balances. They limited the powers of the Constitutional Court, and they appointed party loyalists to every key position in the state administration. Transparency International describes this situation as a state capture, what means that important state institutions and state-owned companies are using taxpayers' money to benefit the economic background of the governing party. So the public procurement is tweaked to benefit companies friendly to the government. And at the same time that they are demonizing critical voices who point out these problems, and they say that the NGOs who receive foreign funding are foreign agents and they are traitors, and this is the very same Russian recipe which we heard is working in other countries as well. And at the end, this summer, as Scott already mentioned, our Prime Minister was openly praising illiberal democracies like Russia or China. He is befriending with the other dictators, like the head of Azerbaijan, who just threw my colleague, a local investigative journalist, into jail to investigating the corrupt dealings of the dictator's family. So these are the new friends of the Fidesz and the Hungarian government. And this comes along with an increasingly hostile statements about the EU and the United States.
What I am particularly struck by in your presentation of the Hungarian case study is how all of the tactics in the authoritarian toolbox are on full display. They learn from each other, they adopt laws almost wholesale and apply them. They innovate and share practices in a number of fora around the world as they try to advocate for a new set of norms that are aligned with their political interests at home. I think one of the challenges continues to be what the source of legitimacy is for these countries, and typically it requires an enemy. But none of us would really, I don't think, be talking about the rise of authoritarianism without a the quote-unquote successful model, and that's how people talk about it, which is the quote-unquote China model. No one looking at China can argue with the fact that it has been enormously successful in bringing hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in a very, very short period of time. They have a belief in technocracy. They have a belief in central planning that has served them well, and they don't want to have any type of political difficulties or challenges to that model, and they are actively evangelizing that model around the world, and it's something that we can talk a bit more about. But to introduce the subject, I just wanted to ask Zach to talk a little bit about what he's seeing in terms of the influence of the Chinese model and just Chinese power in Southeast Asia, and what does it mean for the democracies that are, including the United States, which is fairly far away in some respects.
Thanks. China's the $9.5 trillion gorilla in the room. It is, and as the most important trading partner for every Southeast Asian country, the purchaser of raw materials, ores, linking up Southeast Asian states into their own supply chain, and as a foreign investor. Right now, China has incredible sway over the 10 countries within ASEAN, 500 million people. There's so many ways that we could talk about China's influence. I call it a shadow, but not just a shadow, a long, dark shadow. Human rights has really taken a hit across Southeast Asia in the past 5 years. I could focus on the coup in Thailand, which is a no-brainer to discuss. Clearly, it should be lost on no one that the dictator, General Prayut, has made 2 trips to China. His other members of the junta have made more. And every time that the Americans go out and criticize what's happening there, the reversals, they know who to reach out to and say, we have an alternative. And sadly, Thailand is in for a very hard landing. There's going to be no soft landing coming out of this coup. I could also talk about China's counterinsurgency in Xinjiang against the Uyghurs, which is just, I could not think of a counterinsurgency model that has been more counterproductive. There's a direct and positive correlation between China's strike hard campaign and terrorist attacks. But that has certainly given cover to governments in Myanmar and Burma, their own treatment of the Rohingya and the Rakhine Muslims. It's certainly see it in southern Thailand, where the Thais are battling an ethnic Malay insurgency. We could also look at it in terms of the situation with refugees. China has gone and demanded the return of dissidents and Uyghurs across Southeast Asia, including in Vietnam and Cambodia. If you're ever wondering or asking the question, how much is a human life worth, you can actually come up with an actual figure, because China has recently put $700 million on the table, no strings attached, no questions asked, with Cambodia, and I can guarantee you that they will be coughing up the next Uyghurs that pass through the country. And this has an implication, because just last week you had 13 ethnic Montagnards from Vietnam cross into Cambodia. And before the office, UN High Commission for Human Rights has been able to go in and interview these people, see if they are eligible for bona fide refugee status. The Vietnamese are demanding the same thing, that the Cambodians cough these people up. But the most important way that China has really cast this long, dark shadow is in freedom of speech, media freedoms, and internet freedoms. These have taken the biggest hits in Southeast Asia. And I would say that there's full spectrum media and internet crackdowns. We see everything from state-owned control of the media in single-party states such as Laos and Vietnam. We see violence against journalists, even in countries like the Philippines, which has very robust and media freedoms. We just celebrated, unfortunately celebrated, the 5th anniversary of the Maguindanao massacre, in which 58 people were gunned down, 37 journalists gunned down in cold blood, and not one person has been brought to justice since then. We see it in terms of using libel laws in Malaysia and Singapore to silence dissidents. We have control, maybe not direct censorship in Vietnam the way we used to, but editorial meetings between the party propaganda office and editors, which really creates this sense of self-censorship that is in many ways far more pervasive. There's been attacks on bloggers in Vietnam and journalists, because the authorities have actually learned that intimidation causes much less international furor than putting dissidents on trial, even very quick one-day trials, if that. And so we're seeing this. Across Southeast Asia, the internet has become far more controlled. Just 2 days ago, there was an announcement in Cambodia that the government has gone into the 3 internet service providers and demanded files and all the router records. This happens in other countries. Vietnam controls the internet. Thailand, since the coup, has gone from partly free to not free because of their Computer Crimes Act and abuse of lèse-majesté laws to silence all political dissent. So this is really troubling. One thing that we see, Southeast Asia is known is well known for corruption as well, and here, if you certainly were to plot the scores, and I have done this from Transparency International, and match it up with media freedoms or human rights freedoms, there's a very strong, direct, and positive correlation between high levels of corruption and the lack of free speech. The media simply does not get to play their role as an ombudsman. Singapore is an anomaly in this, in that they actually have low levels of corruption and high levels of media repression. But then again, it's 4 times the size of Washington, D.C. at low tide. It is an anomaly. But everywhere else, we're seeing that the lack of free expression, the lack of a free media, controls over the internet, arrests of bloggers, has a very, very negative impact on socioeconomic development. Thank you.
That's a pretty picture, Zach. One of the things that I've found to be consistent in the discussion so far has been this predominant domination of the media by the respective players, who can use the state-owned media to drive specific messages about what the democracies are really like. And Zach, I was just thinking about, this report came out yesterday, and I don't know if you've had time to take a look at the Chinese news or propaganda, but how are they reacting to the report? And maybe, how's the Iranian media treating the report? I'm curious as to how autocrats are taking a look at these reports and using them.
It's exactly what you would expect. They're gloating. The editorial out of Xinhua yesterday was that the United States is in no position to tell any country how to treat their own citizens. U.S. is in no position to lecture any country about their own human rights situation until they get their own house in order. My rejoinder to that is, at least in America, we can air our very dirty laundry and have a free and open discussion about it. And I challenge anyone, including former Malaysian Prime Minister Dr. Mahathir Mohamad, who has been on a rant about this morning, that if Malaysia could have a free and open discussion about it, it would be a much better place, because they have endemic repression and police torture.
In a way, very similar. They're gloating, but they're also struggling. They're trying to explain why the US decided to publish this report. So if it was a leak, let's say like what happened in Abu Ghraib or other stories, then it would have been easier for them to make the same argument as Zach was saying. But the fact that the US government released this, yes, it provides a lot of ammunition for them to say, see, these are the things they have done. There's no question. But at the same time, I noticed that they're trying to come up with explanations why the US did this, why the government decided to do this. And they have come up with a list of explanations, what's happening, you know, right now with all the demonstrations in Ferguson and other places. These are some other ways of trying to deceive the public opinion and other things. And I think this is very interesting that they don't understand or they don't want to accept the fact that, yes, the US has made all these horrible, horrible mistakes. There's no question. But at the same time, one branch of the government decides to come and publish this. And I find this very interesting.
It's an encouraging point. I wonder if Saudis have even heard about this report.
Undoubtedly they have, because they're very avid readers of the internet. But I really haven't seen any response to it. I don't think that the government will find it all that surprising like the Iranians, because the Saudis know the American system quite well. A lot of the people in government now studied here, and of course there are now currently about 80,000 Saudis studying here. So, but I think that the Saudis have felt for some time now, since the invasion of Iraq in 2003, which turned into a complete mess for us, that the Saudis have felt that, you know, you Americans don't really have the right to lecture us on human rights.
About anything, and when I talk to them.
I mean, there's been a lot of loss of moral authority of the United States ever since 2003 with that invasion. And then Abu Ghraib, which was horrible, and then this whole torture, and then Guantanamo. So everybody else is right. We have to get our house in order if we're going to regain that moral legitimacy.
I had taken the mic away from you at one point when you were wanting to talk about some of the things that we might do with regards to Saudi Arabia. Maybe you could introduce a couple of thoughts here that we could react to, and then I want to be able to get some questions from the floor in our last 15 minutes.
Well, when it comes to Saudi Arabia, you know, a legitimate question is, can the United States promote its values, most importantly democratic pluralism, if both the government and most of Saudis are not interested in having this? And also, can we promote this when we use the rhetoric of Western Christian civilization? The words secularism, democracy, tolerance, sexual orientation, all these things that we take as values, respect for all these things, they don't translate adequately for Muslims who have not yet really, except for some exceptions, but governments have not articulated these universal concepts in their own Islamic vocabulary. And that's something they've got to learn to do, and it's going to take decades to do. But in the meantime, is there something that the United States can do to promote these values? And I think there are. Education is really the way to go. Now, as I just mentioned, there are like 80,000 Saudis studying in the United States. And there's another small program initiated by Saudis in Riyadh to bring imams, prayer leaders, religious professors here to the United States to have dialogue with Christians. It's a religious dialogue program. And from all I hear, it's been quite successful. I think that the more programs that can be initiated by the US government and by NGOs on religious dialogue, any kind of dialogue, bringing Saudis here for short visits, for long visits, is really the way to go. Secondly, the United States always says that, the U.S. officials say, well, we criticize Saudi human rights violations in private. Well, that's all well and good, but we don't know how strong this criticism is made in private. And the second thing is the Saudis are really not going to respond to this until the criticism is public. So I think that the U.S. does have to become a little bit more public in its criticism of Saudi human rights violations. At the same time, has to be very careful in the wording of these criticisms, because the wording is very important. The Saudis will parse that very carefully to see what's being said. So for another way to be public about it without being without getting the Saudis too upset is to go through the the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva. I mean, there the United States can be more active in criticizing Saudi human rights violations. And finally, you know, the United States had a program run by the U.S. Embassy in Riyadh to teach community organizing and to teach, how to get the vote out and things like that. The Saudis shut it down. They didn't want that kind of thing being taught to ordinary Saudis and young people. But hey, there's the internet. I mean, these programs can be taught, advertised by the U.S. government or by NDI and the Republican, promotion of democracy. These things can be advertised, and Saudis can go online to learn about them. The Saudi government can't do much about that. So I think those are some practical steps that could be taken.
Interesting. Well, I don't want to take any more of your time, us talking up here. I want to get some feedback from you all, some quick questions or comments to the panelists or to the moderator, however you like. I think right here, sir. Here's the microphones coming to you right there.
My name is Todd Lang. You want to know who I am, don't read my badge. It says I'm on the staff, but I haven't been promoted yet. I'm a director of the Human Rights First. I'm a partner of Weil, Gotshal & Manges in New York, practicing lawyer for a lot of years. Look, I was just thinking about some stuff I studied a lot of years ago. I think it was Lenin who talked about economic determinism. And the real question is, what's the impact of that on all the various things that you've identified as possible solutions to some of the problems we have here, and most of all, the preservation and expansion of human rights? So anybody want to comment on that?
Any of the panelists want to comment on that?
About what to do with all these things?
No, I mean, maybe I wasn't articulate about it. I'm not. But what I'm suggesting is that Lenin said, you don't get rebellion when people have a full stomach, kids are educated, etc. That's called economic determinism. So if you have a good economy and people are working and they have things for their family and they can grow and presumably can get medicine, all these things mean that you're not going to rebel. You're going to be content with what you have. And that's the question is, what's the economic impact on various things that you've all suggested individually as to how to preserve human rights?
So in Iran, for instance, is the economic situation going to create significant enough challenges for the government that it has to respond by opening up?
I think there is no question that when you earn $800 billion, between $700 to $800 billion under President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, you can use this money to create a very strong patronage system and to keep some portion of the population happy, and then use a variety of methods to co-opt, to intimidate, or to stay in power. There's no question. And at some point, when the oil price starts going down, as we see right now, then things may begin to change. And probably that's why we see in Iran in the past couple of weeks, in the parliament and in some other places, there's this argument that maybe certain institutions that used to be only accountable to the supreme leader, now maybe they have to start paying taxes. So, because the government needs the money. So if the oil price keeps going down, that could have an impact, maybe. And if you go back to even the '79 revolution, one of the reasons that we had strikes and massive demonstrations, 78, 77, 78, 79, was that suddenly the oil prices, they flattened. So that is a factor. And one of the other reasons that the monarchies managed to survive, yes, to some extent you can make the argument that it is the legitimacy that some of these rulers may have, especially in Morocco. But it's also money, petrodollars. When you have the Saudi king suddenly says, we have $100 billion we're going to give to people to get married or other things, so it works. Yes, the economy is a factor, but I don't know if as Lenin says, it is the most fundamental factor. I'm not sure about it. I think it's more like a trigger. That's how I see it.
Interesting. Why don't we go with another question? Because there are a couple. Why don't we take a couple questions? Because we only have about 5 minutes left, apparently. So one here on this side of the room, and then one all the way back on the right-hand side, and then we'll have to call it a day or an hour.
Hi, thank you for a really interesting panel. My name is Catherine Hughes-Freytek, and I've worked on human rights, humanitarian issues in the Middle East for many years in a number of different ways. I guess mainly I'm focusing on one of your comments, Carol, but more generally, I think it's important not to do too much of a broad brushstroke around either Muslim or the Arab world with democracy. I think the Arabs have shown very strongly, and the Muslims, that they're very pro-democracy, and that people, both with the Arab Spring, who spoke with their feet, with their bodies, with their minds, fighting for democracy and going out in the streets against a lot of autocratic regimes that mainly the U.S. supports and keeps in place. But also back to after colonialism with the British and the French, when they were fighting with the Allies against the Turkish-Ottoman alliance because they were promised democratic nations and self-empowerment and self-determination, which was then kind of revoked and over the years. And I agree that it has a lot to do at times with economic interest. Obviously, oil is there.
I'm going to need to...
Yeah, but so my question is, I agree with you that some of the Western concepts may not sit well with the Arab world, but I think democracy is not one of those. So if you could just comment on that, please.
Okay, and in the back?
Charlie Ottstad, I'm a retired U.S. Army veteran. I'd like to add to what she said because it was the crux of my comment and question. Human rights is not a democratic issue, but if we tied our efforts in human rights more to justice, that would ring true to the Muslim Arab world much more than democracy, I believe. So we got to kind of work at this from the angle of justice rather than democracy.
Thank you for the comment. Okay, I'm going to ask each of our panelists just to have 1 minute quickly if they want to respond to either of the questions or just to have a quick closing comment. But please keep it really quick because there are a bunch of autocrats sitting in front of me.
Okay, so I didn't speak about the Russian influence on the Hungarian situation. So Hungary has always been in between, so sometimes it belongs to the east and sometimes to the west. And what we are experiencing now that Russia is reaching out for the former Soviet states and wants to get them back in his orbit, in his zone of influence. They are speaking about a Euro-Asian community instead of the European Union. So you must be aware what happens to Eastern Europe in the next years.
Thank you.
To this woman's comment, I would only say that I think I was misunderstood. What I meant was there's a problem with language. I don't believe that Arabs don't want to have free expression and justice, but they have a innate resistance to concepts articulated in our language. And Islam theologically and politically has all these concepts, but they need to be brought out. They need to be re-articulated in a modern fashion for modern times. And that's what I'm seeing lacking right now in Islamic political thought. That's it.
Which is, I think, plays well on the comment that you made, sir, in the back there. Why don't I go to Mohammed? And then?
I just want to answer the question about policy implications for the U.S. I guess I just want to make 3 points. Number one, we heard yesterday, I think it was Senator Kuhn who said, be the nation that you preach. I think this is absolutely important. You cannot overestimate how much stories of Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib empower autocrats all the way down to the level of individual interrogators and people who torture. Number two, the very question or comment someone made yesterday about how when the U.S. allocates certain amount of money, it undermines certain people in these countries. Back in February 2006, the U.S. allocated, I think, $75 million to help democracy promoters in Iran. Before the money had been even allocated, certain people in the country were arrested. So I'm not saying don't support them, but be careful how you're going to support them. And finally, related to the question, the last comment question we had today, be outspoken when it comes to human rights issues. If you don't want to promote democracy, that's fine, but on human rights, be very specific and be as outspoken as you can, because it helps. Publicity helps.
Thank you, Mohammed. Zach?
Let me just quickly speak to the issue of justice. I just came back from southern Thailand, where you've had an insurgency raging for over a decade now. And the single greatest irritant to the local Malay is the culture of impunity of security forces. And I've seen it before in Indonesia, in Aceh, in southern Philippines as well. So this idea of security force impunity is a major irritant around the region. But I'm also, I'd like to end on a positive note. If anyone follows Vietnam, you'll know that since the summer when the president came out and spoke about the issue of police torture, false confessions, and wrongful convictions, there has been a string of reversals. Police put on trial, judges being arrested for this because they know, even in an anti-democratic regime, that this lack of justice truly threatens their legitimacy, and they're starting to clean it up.
Well, I want to thank all of the panelists and all of you for your attention and participation. I'm sorry, I am being told I'm out of time, and so I'm really sorry. But I want to thank everybody for participating. I want to thank the panelists. I ask you to join me in thanking them for this incredible discussion. So thank you very much.